So we all know that one video game is different from the way it's designed from another video game. If you factor in things like the style of game, the game engine, the nature of the game, the code, the progression, and all of these different things, you'll realize that the differences begin to stack up much more than just meets the eye. The Gotham Knights conversation has come to light because I have brought it back to light using Zelda as my culprit. Zelda Tears of the Kingdom runs at 30 FPS on a Nintendo Switch, and many came out to say, well, it's the Nintendo Switch, and some probably didn't pay attention to knowing that the Nintendo Switch could actually run other games at 60 FPS. So these other games, including Diablo Part 3, I think, and Mortal Kombat 11, are the case studies today. I've heard people say Diablo is a game that was developed in 2012, so why compare it with Zelda? And it makes me laugh because it seems like they skipped the Mortal Kombat 11 game, which is a game that I don't know when it was developed, but is a more recent title anyways. But still, nonetheless, the 60 FPS standard is something that we're looking for, right? And at this point in time, if we're going to even talk about anything, should we be talking about the machines, the consoles, and their limitations? Possibly we should be, but it seems nobody wants to listen, or at least some elements in our gaming community don't care. Horizon Forbidden West is running at 60 FPS, therefore, every game should run at 60 FPS. It's a very interesting argument because we could make the same argument for the Switch and say Diablo is running at 60 FPS, therefore, every game should run at 60 FPS. But you know that that is not a smart way to go about an argument. Even though you claim that the console may be 6-7 years old, you also can basically make the same argument saying that the Diablo version that was made for the console was made more recently. So if they were able to take that game that was from 2012 to run it at 60 FPS on the Switch, why did the newer game, Tears of the Kingdom, or its developers not factor that in and prioritize 60 FPS? But no one is prioritizing 60 FPS on the Switch. That's not really the point that I'm making. What I'm saying is that if you use that standard, why can that standard not apply to Gotham Knights? Some people have said it's because the PlayStation 5 and Series X can do 60 FPS. This is why. But that's not really a problem, in my opinion, because the Switch can also do 60 FPS. I think it boils down to recognizing the differences between these video games. Now, Diablo is a top-down game, but I made the argument, according to the way we were having these conversations, that Diablo, even though many might think it's a 2012 game, the tenets of making video games are really not that different. There are specific things that you have to factor in when you're making your game, but the methodology of making video games have not really changed from a long time ago. Some people argue that it's actually different, and I say, okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the difference between a top-down game and a third-person game. If you fire up Unreal Engine 4 or Unreal Engine 5, you'll notice that you actually have templates that they've actually designed for you. So if you want to kind of get a head start and not do all the groundwork in building everything from scratch, you can pretty much select a top-down template or you can select a third-person template. When you do so, you'll realize very simply that these two modes are basically the same with specific differences to the camera position and to the movement controls. There really is not much that's different from these two when it comes to the overall gameplay. And if you actually think about it, the main things that you're going to factor in is how your assets and your world is going to be built and presented to the player. In the case of a top-down game, you're actually not really too burdened by asset quality and a lot of those visual aspects that will actually run your machine and task them very well. Think about it. In an Uncharted game, you walk into a room, Nathan Drake is looking at, say, a picture on the wall. You want that picture on the wall to be rendered very well. In the case of a game like Diablo, you're not necessarily going to prioritize that because your asset quality is more than likely going to be much lower because you're dealing with and prioritizing other aspects of your game, like movement controls, making sure that the world is interactive in a sense with your character and other characters out there. If you want more detail, you can go for it, but you'd have to maybe make a dynamic camera to be able to enjoy that visual fidelity. Like, say, maybe you walk into a place and there's a cutscene. Then maybe you tweak your cameras, or maybe you want your character to visualize something. Then you can zoom into that item and then give it a little bit more quality. But by and large, they're still pretty much the same. You could change the camera for your Diablo game, and then, you basically be able to have a camera over the shoulder of your player character. And you can also change your movement parameters. That's the big deal, because the movement parameters, they work with something that's called, in Unreal Engine 4 anyways, a navigation, mesh. This is something that basically, I don't know exactly what it is, but what it does is it tells elements how to specifically move in a designed way, in a designated way. So it's more of a directional or directed positioning in terms of movement. And what I mean by that is, in the case of the top-down, game, if you're using a mouse and a keyboard control, you pretty much tell, the character and click on the position and say, character, go over here. And that click is what that navigation mesh is looking for. It's looking for the instructions to execute and tell the character, go stand over there. In the case of, say, maybe AI, a navigation mesh is also used in order to tell the AI exactly where to move. So the AI is using a navigation mesh, which is like a container that holds instructions to say, go over here, go over there. But when you think about the third person perspective and you think about the top down perspective, you also are in a position where you're left to say, well, I guess this is a decision of the developers to have gone ahead to do this. And if they wanted to go with much better visual fidelity, then there will be sacrifices that they'd have to make if they went the third person route, which is what Zelda Tears of the Kingdom has done. As much as people may be saying, but it's the Switch, we need a Switch Pro and so on and so forth, I think it's starting to become much more prevalent that a game, which is basically a follow-up to Breath of the Wild, being a little bit more ambitious, is now requiring more hardware. Because even though it was developed with 30 FPS in mind, its ambition is still pushing, the limits of what the consoles can do. Think about Gotham Knights, which was developed with 30 FPS in mind, and in my opinion, scaled more than its original consoles in terms of capacity and, capability to run the game. That is the Xbox One and PS4. It's interesting to think that to just bring them to the new consoles would then eventually make it 60 FPS when you've not made the necessary sacrifices, like tweaking your asset detail, tweaking your world design, tweaking the way your open world streams, and so on and so forth to be able to get it at 60 FPS. Gotham Knights, I think, can run at 60 FPS on the PS5 and Series X. The challenge is it's going to be a different Gotham Knights than the one you have right now. The one you have right now looks very, very good at 30 FPS. To tweak it to a 60 FPS version would have to require the developers going in to redesign, huge elements of it. The way the developers at Focus Interactive designed the Plague Tale, I think I don't know if it was Focus Interactive that did the development themselves. I know they're the publishers, and they were able to take the game from the max of about 38 to 40 FPS all the way to 60 FPS. It required for them to go back, in my opinion, to redesign specific aspects of the game that was causing performance issues. Example, when the rats would swarm, that was dropping FPS, and specific aspects of the game, like visual effects and so on and so forth, these were things that were causing the game to actually stutter or at least not be able to perform consistently. So that Plague Tale that came out at launch, the one that you guys loved, and the one that the developers have now made to start running at 60 FPS, are different games in the sense that they've actually been redesigned in specific areas to allow for better performance. So this is the reality that everybody has to come, into terms with. In fact, if you look at the 60 FPS mods on Zelda right now with people that have been able to emulate the game, some of them are facing instability issues at 60 FPS because the game wasn't designed as with 60 FPS in mind. Hence, specific elements in terms of frame time and lighting and all of the above seem like they will need to be tweaked to be able to get you that performance in a much more consistent state. So yes, whether it be the Switch or the PS5 or the Series X or even a gaming PC, they will reach their limits at some point in regard to how a game is already designed at its core. For people to continue to make the comparison with Gotham Knights, Horizon Forbidden West, and God of War, and so on and so forth, they negate all of the different elements that is required in a video game or for a video game to stand alone as its own thing. When you even factor in the different game engines, then you start to see that there might be a pattern somewhere. Think about the last few games that have had a lot of challenges in terms of performance when they were released, but their console versions were quite okay. Most of these games have been Unreal Engine 4 games. Callisto Protocol comes to mind, Jedi Survivor comes to mind, and Gotham Knights comes to mind. The PC ports of these three games have had a lot of challenges coming out the bat because whenever your world is either a little bit open or maybe you have a much more detailed setup for the way you actually are streaming in your world, it seems Unreal Engine has had a lot of problems, or at least the developers have not necessarily been able to figure out exactly how to plan for making very streamlined Unreal Engine 4 games. Unreal Engine 4 is more like an open source software in a sense. Like, a lot of developers know how to use the engine. So when it comes down to it, there really hasn't necessarily been studios that have nailed down that, game engine to the way that they can make their games run very smoothly. Or let me put it this way. There are not a lot of studios that have nailed down the Unreal Engine to be able to make it run smoothly. Your games in Sony's own studios, like Horizon, God of War, these engines that are used within these studios have already been nailed down over years with different iterations being made. So they know how they can use the engines to leverage exactly what it is they want. And if they don't know, they either have to make a way by calling their, teams together to maybe make the aspects of their game actually happen or work as they want, or they are in a position where they just have the resources that are necessary. An example will be God of War 2018. There's an article out there, I can't find it anymore, but I remember Cory Barlog actually talking about how it took him a while to figure out how to actually make Atreus a side playable character. You see, this was something that had not necessarily been done for a long time. So what he did was he took his big, huge gameplay designer guy and said, hey, man, let's go visit Naughty Dog. They've done, companion AI in a sense. So they went to Naughty Dog. They were asking questions. And he said Naughty Dog could not really help him because even Naughty Dog's AI, you don't control. The AI just basically helps you fight and do stuff, but it's all controlled from a different set of code bases. So in their studio, they had to go back and they had to figure out how they were going to do it. I can guarantee you that if they needed their gameplay programmers or their engine programmers to do something to make it work, they had access to that. If you're using Unreal Engine, you don't necessarily have access to gameplay or game engine programmers that really know all of the ins and outs of the engine itself. So you're kind of limited as well in how your game is going to run. Knowing and understanding these things make for a much more nuanced conversation. I've seen some people that are in bad faith making accusations and insulting other people. Somebody called me a boomer. I thought that was funny. And in all of this, you can't really get anywhere with all the noise. I want to create a community of gamers that understand what game development is about, that can see behind the scenes. Not a bunch of meme warriors or keyboard, thugs that think that they can just come and just say nonsense. Because this is how we actually develop a bigger set of respectable paradigms with developers. Like, I see why developers and gamers are always at odds with one another. No one really understands where everybody else is coming from. And in some cases, developers, could feel like they're, being attacked or whatever it is. And gamers could feel like they're being cheated. But until everybody can come down and kind of sit down and say, what is going on with this particular project? What are the circumstances around them? We're never going to make headway. What you're going to continue to see is the developers are going to basically be shooting out these games based on their publishers as, best as they possibly can, because publishers said it's over, send it out of the, mail. But when we gamers start getting a better understanding, the publishers are not going to be able to do this nonsense, because we're not just sitting there whining, 30 FPS, 60 FPS, but now we actually have a better understanding as to why a game may be 30 FPS or 60 FPS. And if you don't like a game at 30 FPS, it's fine. You don't have to play it. But at least you have to be sensible in how you engage in these conversations. So, again, the whole data is there. All this stuff is free on the internet. And you can pretty much be able to get a better sense as to how things work. As much as we don't know everything and how all of it works, we still have at least enough educational material available to us to educate ourselves. Thanks for watching the video. Peace out.